All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Rebecca Englert, and I'm a PhD student from the University of Calgary. And today I'm going to be talking about a study that builds off of work done by Ahe Valinga as part of his PhD, where he used a numerical model to examine the flow processes associated with upstream migrating bedforms that are commonly found in sandy submarine channels and canyons. An example of which is shown on in the bathymetric image on the left, where you can see some trains of concentric bedforms in submarine channels on the Squamish flow delta. And the image on the right, which is from the location of that yellow star, is an long channel multi-beam image that shows turbidity current interacting with the bedform at this location. And although we have these new data sets, thanks to the work of people like John Hughes Clark, there's still some major challenges in directly monitoring or directly measuring key properties of flows, such as their density and sediment concentration. And as a result, the flow processes associated with these bedforms, and also even the identification of the type of bedform, remain uncertain. So the objective of this study was to use a depth-resolved computational fluid dynamic model to constrain the flow processes associated with the initiation and maintenance of bedforms in submarine channels. And these particular bedforms are sandy, they're Decameter-scale, and they've been observed to migrate upstream. And the advantage of this approach, as shown in the image on the bottom, is that we're able to simulate these processes to scale and observe elusive flow properties such as their sediment concentration. So the simulations were run using a Reynolds averaging Navier-Stokes model in a software program called Flow2D. And the model space is shown in the image on the left. It consisted of a 2D, 200-meter long, 20-meter high grid. In each trial, turbidity currents were simulated over an erodible sediment bed with meter scale viscosity for about 1 to 2 hours. And 15 trials were conducted with varied input conditions, which are shown on the right-hand side. So we used 3 different values for flow velocity, flow thickness, sediment concentration, and slope. And then all the flows have the same grain size distribution, which consisted of equal parts of those 4 grain sizes, which range from silt to medium sand. And the model output were grids of the sediment concentration and flow velocity fields every 50 seconds. So in 6 of the 15 simulation trials, bedforms developed on the slope. So I'm going to play a video from one of these trials, and the video is showing the flow concentration field. Just to note, I've logged the scale in order for better visualization of the flow. So I'll start the video. And you can see that the flow initially erodes, and after a period of time, a train of bedforms develop that are preceded by a steeper slope. And these bedforms have wavelengths between 20 to 60 meters and wave heights between 0.5 to 2.5 meters, and they migrate upslope. And initially, the flow configuration is a bit unstable with the bedforms and varies in time and space, and the bedforms migrate inconsistently. At some point, this flow configuration stabilizes, just about now in the video, and the bedforms migrate more rapidly. At the end of the trials, erosion occurs below the flow inlet, and this significantly alters the flow conditions such that it produces a flow that does not appear to interact with the bedforms, and bedform migration stops. So you can divide up these trials in different ways. We analyze the properties of flows over 2 regions, the slope region, which preceded the bedforms, and then the bedform region, which contains the bedforms. And we also divided up these trials temporally based on flow states, which are defined by the flow configuration with the bedforms. So as I described in the video, there's this unstable state where flows interact with bedforms, but the flow configuration is varied and bedforms migrate intermittently. Then there's a stable state where the flow configuration is consistent and bedforms migrate more rapidly. And then finally, there's this neutral phase where the flows don't interact with or migrate the bedforms. In the remaining 9 of the 15 simulation trials, no bedforms developed, so I'll play a video from one of these trials. Again, there's some initial erosion by the head of the turbidity current, but after this, not too much happens on the slope. There is some minor deposition that mainly acts to smooth the initial rugosity. These trials were analyzed over a region of the slope away from the flow inlet that's highlighted by that gray box, and they make up a bedforms absent flow state. So to summarize, there are 2 different types of trials we observed: trials where bedforms were present and trials where bedforms were absent. And we can divide these into 4 different flow states. And then these can be grouped based on flows that initiated and maintained bedforms, which I'll refer to as bedform-forming flows, and include the unstable and the stable state. And then there were flows that do not form or interact with bedforms. I'll refer to these as non-bedform forming flows, and this includes the neutral and bedforms absent state. So using these groups, we can now compare the properties of flows that did and did not form bedforms. This series of panels shows some examples of bedform forming flows. So the top 2 rows show snapshots of the flow velocity and sediment concentration fields. And the dashed line represents the height of the velocity maximum, which you can see bounds a denser layer of higher sediment concentration. And the properties of the flows and thickness of this layer vary in relation to the bedform topography, such that the layer is thin on the lee slope of the bedforms and then abruptly thickens onto the stow slope of the bedforms. And the lower panel shows the Froude number calculated for the entire flow and the base of the flow below the velocity maximum, where values over 1, which are highlighted by the gray box, indicate supercritical flow conditions, and values below 1 indicate subcritical flow conditions. So you can see that flows are supercritical on the slope preceding the bedforms, and then fluctuate between being subcritical and supercritical over the bedforms. And the transition between supercritical and subcritical flow occurs abruptly at the least dose break of bedforms, and also corresponds to where the flow thickens. So this indicates the presence of hydraulic jumps, and this flow configuration is consistent with a bedform referred to as cyclic steps. We can use the same types of panels to look at examples of non-bedform forming flows, which are shown here. You can see that there are some fluctuations in the flow velocity and the sediment concentration fields, but they don't correspond with underlying topography. These flows are dilute throughout, and they remain supercritical along the horizontal domain. And so comparing these observations, we can discuss the formative controls on upstream migrating bedforms. So the graphs on the left show average velocity and density profiles for each flow state in each trial, and they're shown and calculated over the slope region and the bedform region. And you can see that bedform forming flows, which are represented by the red and the green lines, are distinctly faster and denser than non-bedform forming flows, which are represented by the blue and the purple lines. And this occurs both over the slope region and the bedform region. This is further highlighted by the graphs on the right, which show average sediment concentration below the velocity maximum, where a value of around 5% volume seems to distinguish these 2 flow groups. So from these results, it seems that density is really important in flows that form bedforms. You can also use these results to test previously hypothesized formative controls, and one of the most common ones is that upstream migrating bedforms in submarine channels are associated with supercritical flow conditions. So we can look at the Froude number over the slope and the bedform region, and the graphs on the screen show cumulative probability plots for the Froude number for each flow state in each trial, similar to before. And you can see that over the slope region, the Froude numbers are pretty similar between the different flow states. However, over the bedform region, bedform-forming flows have lower Froude numbers compared to non-bedform-forming flows that include values below 1. So what is evident from these graphs is that actually all of these flows are dominated by supercritical flow conditions. So supercritical flow seems necessary to form these bedforms. However, not all supercritical flows form bedforms. And in fact, often the bedform-forming flows had lower Froude numbers compared to the non-bedform-forming flows, despite being faster. And this is because if we look at the equation for the Froude number, it not only depends on the flow velocity, but also has a term for the excess density of the flow, which is in the denominator, so we'll drive the Froude number down.
2 minutes, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you. So we can validate these model results by comparison to other studies. So again, this is at a long channel multi-beam image from the Squamish Pro Delta. It's set at the same scale as a snapshot of a flow concentration field from the simulation file. And both are showing flow over a bed form. So you can see that the scale and morphology of the bed forms is similar, and also the size and nature of the flows is comparable. And in fact, when John Hughes Clark was analyzing this data set, he noted the occurrence of an acoustically attenuating layer that thickened at the least dose break of a bed form, and he interpreted this to be a hydraulic jump, a denser basal layer undergoing a hydraulic jump. So that's very consistent with the properties of the bedform-forming flows in our models. So in summary, we identified 4 different flow states, which allowed for the comparison of properties of flows that did and did not form or interact with bedforms. Bedform-forming flows were characterized by denser basal layers that alternated between supercritical and subcritical flow conditions, which demonstrate that these bedforms are cyclic steps. And lastly, our simulation results are consistent with field observations of sandy Decameter-scale upstream-migrating bedforms in submarine channels. And so this supports their application in these settings. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions if there's time, or I can respond to them later.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this interesting presentation. There is a question coming from the audience, and the question addresses what look like these really large turbulent structures at the top of the flow. And the question is whether the turbulence in these upper structures is whether the flow is different from the flow in the bottom part of the current that carries the majority of the sediment. So can you talk a little bit about these?
Yeah, so there's Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities that develop on the upper interface of the flow. There also seems to be an instability kind of at the position of the velocity maximum that has like the opposite sense to the Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities. And they're present in both the bedform-forming and non-bedform-forming flows. But this kind of lower instability seems to get sort of locked in place over the bedforms. And I guess the relation between these two stabilities is not something we've totally figured out yet.
There's no diagnostic state in either of those instabilities that relates to the bedform evolution and the bedforms being there.
They're both present in both types of flows. It's just when the bedforms are present, they become kind of locked in place. So
okay.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to.
No, I understand.
Sure about the formative relationship there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So be sure to add extra questions for Rebecca in the question boxes so she can address them later.